Elevator Systems, Bowen Family Systems Theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, where we look at ideas from Bowen Family Systems Theory in brief and understandable ways. This season, we're looking at just various topics and how Bowen Family Systems Theory is a useful perspective. Today, we are discussing mental health, and joining us is Samantha Stokesberry. Thanks for being here, Sam.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right. Here's your bio. Sam is a licensed professional counselor, consultant, speaker, and PhD candidate who grounds her work in Bowen theory. She's a firstborn daughter with two younger siblings. She grew up in Miami, Florida, and now lives in Austin, Texas. Sam's professional path was shaped by 4 years living in South Africa, where playing professional soccer and coaching at a futsal academy. Is that right?
Futsal, yep.
Okay. Led her to nonprofit work and her first real-world exposure to the human trafficking industry. These experiences had a role in her choosing a career in the mental health field, and today Sam provides counseling, consultation, and training services in Texas and across the world. She specializes in working with trafficking survivors and their families, and families impacted by incest, sexual abuse, and chronic anxiety. She's done training at the Bowen Center, and her soon-to-be published doctoral research examines differentiation of self, family unit functioning, and post-traumatic growth in female adult survivors of trafficking in the U.S. So welcome. I'm sure your research and professional experience is going to greatly inform your thinking. You get the first elevator pitch on Bowen theory and mental health.
Okay, so here is the pitch that I came up with. It's 3 sentences, which I'm very proud of. I was able to get it that short. Okay. Bowen theory has helped me to see mental health through a natural systems lens, where anxiety is a normal, biological, and relational process rather than a pathology. It has showed me how a clinician's instinct to rescue and help can actually intensify a client's functional helplessness, and how relating to the capable adult inside of a client who looks helpless can change the entire dynamic of the therapeutic process. Bowen theory also offers a reframe for my clinical role from being an expert to being a resource. And this provides me with an opportunity to see the individuals and families I work with as capable of becoming a resource to themselves.
Excellent. Katie, your turn.
Am I up? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 sentences. I'm pretty proud of myself as well. So I think I basically choose to focus on various concepts, ideas. So I think that with mental health, I've gone a lot of different directions, but here's where I landed. I think Bowen theory allows me to highlight the importance of the helper's work on self and the importance of the triangle when I'm thinking of mental health. I need to always work at differentiation when interacting with the mental health system and also the family. So I have more to say, but that's my pitch.
Okay. Good. Mine is a mental health diagnosis often happens in an individual at one moment in time, usually a highly stressful and symptomatic time, but that diagnostic label can last a lifetime. Bowen theory is a helpful way to step back and see more. 2 ways I'm thinking this. Step back to see the context and relationships an individual is a part of, and how the stress of the relationships impacts the individual, just as the individual impacts the system stress. And then step back and see variation in individual functioning and symptoms across time. Mental health isn't just in an individual, it's across time, in contexts, and relationships. And then we have a couple other pitches. I don't know, Katie, do you have suggestions which ones that I do here? One that I just ran across today, it's from, it's quoted in Dr. Kerr's Bowen Theory Secrets, but it's Mary Kerr from the Liars Club. A dysfunctional family is any family with more than one person in it.
Yes.
And then, yeah, what are your thoughts, Katie?
So I the one I brought was Joe Berger did a talk for Living Systems recently and shared this Kathy Kerr article, which I ran out to read because she said, the more undifferentiated the professional, the more he is at the mercy of the climate of the healthcare emotional system. He is unable to think for himself about patients apart from the system's view of them. And I just thought that I told him, I was like, that's a mic drop quote, like that really I think I'm thinking about the professionals interacting with the
Mm.
system. So that was really useful to think about the role that the professional is playing in that interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the one
Mm-hmm.
I came with. What other one did you have, Dixie?
Well, I have one from Dr. Bowen from Family Therapy and Clinical Practice. The clinical effort was to think and act toward the families according to the family orientation. This meant avoiding the concepts sick, illness, and patient, and avoiding the use of diagnoses and treating the triadic one or any other family member as a sick person. I think that kind of highlights the different lens of a system's perspective. So, all right, lots of ideas. Where do you guys go with it all?
Yeah, I think, Katie, to some of the points that you brought up, a lot of my thinking has also been about kind of like the role of the counselor and how Bowen theory has impacted my work in the counseling room, probably even more so than like the work I do with the clients, more about like what I'm noticing in self and in my own family of origin, and how what's going on with me and my family of origin is directly impacting my clinical practice. And that's been like a huge realization I've had, is that, you know, by being able to observe more and learn more about my own functioning in my family, I'm able to kind of carry what I'm learning into the counseling room, where a lot of those things I maybe was doing before were very automatic and I didn't even notice they were automatic until I started thinking about them. So that's been a big thing I've noticed, is just the shift in my own functioning as a counselor by applying Bowen in my own personal life.
Yeah, I appreciate that in your pitch, the idea of moving from an expert to a resource. And I think what a useful position to come towards a family as a resource versus someone who's going to tell them what to do. And I think maybe that's unusual, and that would be a shift maybe to some families to not be told what to do. So there might be a little discomfort to get through, but I just think in the long run it makes such a difference to just have that space open for thinking with the family. And I think one of the things I hoped we talked about is also the system that's attached to that family, right? When you come, when a person comes to your office because they're depressed, you aren't just thinking about that person. When you're thinking systemically, you're thinking about their system, and their system can be their family. Their system potentially includes a psychiatrist or a mental health team or their church or their community, I think, and the ability to have that lens of keeping that system in mind, I think, is really useful for the clinician.
Yeah, I would agree. And I have an example that I think highlights that really well. And I don't know if now is a good time to share it.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Go for it.
When I call myself a baby counselor, when I was a baby counseling intern back in like 2022, I had a client who was brought to me by her parents, and she was 15 at the time. And she came to me for chronic anxiety. So she was having a lot of physical symptoms. So nausea, stomach aches, she was skipping school, she wasn't sleeping very well. So her parents referred her to me for that. And at this point, I had just finished my graduate program. I was very person-centered, therapy-focused. I was just starting to learn Bowen theory, so I didn't know much yet. So I was coming into that from a very person-centered kind of approach. So positive regard, empathy, the rapport between counselor and client. And I would say about like 6 months into working with this client, she finally disclosed to me that she had been sexually abused by her paternal grandfather. And when that disclosure came out, there was an immediate spike in anxiety in me, in her family, in her, in my supervisor, in the director of the practice. I mean, everybody's anxiety just immediately spiked. And then as a mandated reporter, I had to file a report with DFPS, and her parents decided to file a report with the police department where the abuse had occurred in Texas. And one of the most interesting things about that case was to see how quickly the anxiety spread from the family to the system outside of the family. And the one thing that comes to mind is I remember when the DA got involved, the assistant DA, the child advocate, the detective, they were all involved in different interlocking triangles. I remember getting phone calls from the DA from the goodness of her heart, trying to convince me to get my client to testify against her grandfather in court. And there was a lot of pressure and a lot of expectation of this is the right thing. This is what she should do. And initially I got caught up in that. My own anxiety was like, yes, she needs to testify. He's a perpetrator. This is wrong. She's a victim. And there was a lot of content-based and linear thinking that was going on in me at the time. And what I realized, and it almost felt like this epiphany, is I had realized that I was in a way repeating the same patterns that this client had experienced during her abuse. And that sounds so intense, but this idea of I wasn't really giving her a choice. There was a lot of coercion and pressure of, you need to think this way, you need to behave this way. And I was taking away her autonomy. And that's what abuse survivors, they experience, that this loss of power and this sense of helplessness. And when I realized that, I was like, oh my gosh, like I want to give her this space to be a self and to reclaim that power and autonomy for herself, to think for herself, make her own choices. So I ended up, luckily, I was kind of far enough into Bowen theory that I was able to think a little bit about differentiation and get curious about that and realize my own overfunctioning and my own anxiety playing a role. But it was really hard, and the intensity was really high, and the family's anxiety was really high. So it got messy because I basically took my hands off and said, this is up to you, and I'm going to let you make this choice for yourself. And my client decided not to go to trial. And that was the best decision for her, for what she wanted to do at the time. Her family didn't love it. The court didn't love it. The DA didn't love it. So there was a lot of backlash. But it was that's just one example of, like, it was so interesting to see the anxiety spread so quickly, and everybody bringing their own kind of, like, I think of the societal emotional process too, of like, again, what are these expectations that the system has, and the anxiety that the system brings to the table, along with what are the individual people bringing to the table as well.
Yeah, I think that's so great. I was thinking about, I read someone talking about thinking with the client on how they define the problem. And I was thinking about there because I imagine all of those other people in the system would have defined the problem differently potentially than that young woman who's, like, oh my goodness, I have all this stuff coming at me. that is the problem I'm potentially up against. But I just think that's such a useful example. I was thinking of that like grade school experiment when you watch like the diffusion, when the teacher shows like adding the colored dye to watch it spread throughout the system. And that was what I was thinking about, because I watch that so often in mental health, especially around any disclosure of abuse. There is nothing that gets a mental health system stirred up faster than disclosure of abuse, because it fires everybody's anxiety up.
What do you think helped you as a new clinician to kind of think for yourself in the midst of all sorts of pressure?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daisy.
Code of ethics and all the things.
Yeah. I think, well, I will say I was already starting my adventure into Bowen theory at the time. And funny enough, it was actually required by the site I was at where I was doing my internship. They required us to learn Bowen theory. And I hated it. I was like, I don't like this. This is stupid. This is heartless. I hate it. And so I will forever be grateful to my, I'll call her my coach, who was at the center, who trained us every week in Bowen theory, Rachel Gardner, shout out to Rachel, because she put up with my crap every week when I would come in and just buck up against her. And I was super reactive and like, well, what about this? And how does this work? And she just managed herself so beautifully with me. And I think that created this space where I could learn and I could see the theory in action in the way that she was engaging with me in our relational process. So I think having that helped me to kind of understand, okay, this is what it can look like. And I actually kind of like this. If I really am honest with myself, it's like, I see how this works and how it's helpful. And I started applying it. And then once I started applying it and I saw the changes it was making in me and my own reactivity, I saw the usefulness in it. And then I just kept going. And that's when I started doing the continuing studies program at the Bowen Center and the postgrad program. So I've always been very hungry for learning. And so I think I had a really good environment where they helped to cultivate that for me as a new counselor.
This is so not a topic for this podcast, but I get so interested in, how, as a teacher, like, what is the difference in a learner when they go at it saying, I don't know if this stuff makes any sense, and really grapple with it for themselves versus just kind of saying, this is it. I got it. This makes sense. So I'm tucking that question away from myself based on what you just said.
Yeah.
Dixie, did you have an example that you wanted to bring?
Well, I had an example that I wanted to refer to, but that I didn't want to dig into, partially because I didn't have time to prepare. But um, the movie A Beautiful Mind is about John Nash and schizophrenia, and in Dr. Kerr's Bowen Theory Secrets, which I think is behind me on the shelf here, there is a chapter at the end. There's four chapters at the end of that book where he looks at certain people from a really broad family systems lens, and John Nash is one of them, and looking at his symptoms across time kind of goes along with my pitch, which is a little bit more of less the clinician aspect. But when you think about mental health across time and what leads to increase and decrease in symptoms, it's a really, really interesting read, which I think would pair with seeing the movie or other readings, but just very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So that is my ill-prepared example to throw out to people.
I thought of an example that was fairly similar to thinking about what a client and a clinician, how they manage when up against a system. And I like that. I think one of the things that family systems theory brings to me is the ability to step back, have different questions maybe than some other folks there, not just sit in symptoms. I think that's something with mental health. Like, we can do a lot of conversations talking around symptoms. I was thinking of this client with depression who, just observing the ability to have a different conversation about onset and what was going on in the larger picture, and what does she notice is going on around her when symptoms get better or worse, is just very different than, the consultation I might have when her psychiatrist is calling me and saying, well, we tried this med. What did you notice with this med versus that med and this med? And,
right.
And how do I manage myself in that interaction with that psychiatrist was such a tool. And I think the thing that came out of that specific instance I'm thinking of that was a useful tool for me is to be able to have that resource expand to other triangles. Now, I'm bringing an example where I think it worked well. I think there's other examples where that psychiatrist might not be interested in my thinking. This one was. And so just to think about the different resource that was in that triangle, to be able to say, I might think differently about this, and here's some things I'm observing, and to be able to talk to the client. One thing that really resonated for Sam's story is I think that was so useful in that triangle for me to be able to talk with the client about what does she think about what's going on and what does she want to do and not do. And so I think that ability to manage self in the context of those triangles is something that I think is so important when a clinician is thinking about working with mental health and in all broad categories. Yeah, that was my example. Not very specific, but I think just there are so many interlocking triangles available when you're sitting in these circumstances. I was writing them all down and I was like, insurance, professional regulation, other theoretical models. If you're working at an agency, you might be up against different people. I mean, talking about the family that has a family therapist, a couples therapist, 2 individual therapists, a child therapist, that's like 6 professionals working with a family. I think Kathleen Colley said on one of our podcasts, I don't think anybody needs that many therapists.
Add in an EA at the school maybe or something as well.
Yeah. And so just how do you think through how you as a professional want to interact with that system? And I think it is important to interact with that system. I said one of my takeaway things is going to be Amy posted in the most recent Family Systems Journal, which for those of you that are watching us, I put a picture up of it here. She did the faculty case conference. We're really talking about how Bowen theory makes a difference in clinical practice, thinking about these interlocking triangles. So I would encourage folks to go take a look at that.
What do you think is, I'm really curious about your work with human trafficking, which once again is a very intense topic. And yeah, what do you notice how that intensity impacts, I don't know, solutions?
I think
helping.
There was this, there's a quote, and I wrote it down because I was thinking about it this morning, from Dr. Bowen, and it was a presentation he did at the Rotary Club in Kansas. And in this quote, he talks about how all patients are made and not born, but that the same personality defects and struggles present in them are present in all of us, and that mental illness was more of a matter of degree, and that personality difficulties, all the way from the severe psychoses through the hysterias, the neuroses, criminality, divorce, sex crimes, delinquency, alcoholism, racial prejudice, individual and group conflict, all the way down to simple human unhappiness and inadequacy, were not separate and individual problems, but they were merely different manifestations of the same basic personality struggle. This is a different concept from the old one about mental illness. That quote changed the way I understand human trafficking, because before, when I first was exposed to it, I thought it was this unique, awful thing. And it is awful, but it's not unique. And I realized that when Dr. Bowen described this idea of kind of like this anxiety showing up in families to varying degrees, I would put trafficking on a very intense degree. It's a more intense manifestation of the same problem that all families struggle with. And that helped me to kind of reframe the way that I was working with my clients and kind of seeing it systemically. And I think that was really helpful because, and I think, again, Katie, you mentioned this, but like being able to think about the other concepts when working with clients, like being able to kind of integrate all of them makes a difference. And I think it helps me to stay zoomed out when I'm working with trafficking clients, because it's so easy to get zoomed in on, again, victim, perpetrator, right, wrong, good, bad, that you lose sight of the complexity and the multi-generational process and the societal emotional process and the family protection, all these things that play a role. Being able to view a survivor on my couch as a part of a I don't want to say normal family, but as a part of a human family and a natural system, just like a person on my couch with anxiety or depression or, another issue they're struggling with. I think that helps me a lot, to stay grounded in theory. And also, I think it also helps me to keep from putting them in a victim position, which I think it can be tempting for counselors and helping professionals to do. I think it's easy to say, oh no, this person is a victim and they need help. But I think sometimes that mentality can actually keep that cycle going and keep that client stuck in that helpless position, even if the intent is, I'm trying to lift you up. It's like, well, they might need to lift themselves up and you might need to back off. So I think, that's been helpful for me to think about, because the intensity is so high. It's so easy to get sucked into the emotional processes.
Yeah, as no one would be surprised, it got my mind thinking when you were talking of individuality and togetherness. Those that listen to the podcast know I think a lot about individuality and togetherness, and just, those things that you're up against when being part of, a community that's tackling a big problem, and how to hold on to your own thinking in the face of something that I mean, I'm not, it is a big problem, right? It's a very challenging problem, but I appreciate what you said about the variation. I think that quote really highlighted that we're all in it, but to a greater variation. So, one depressed person isn't the same as another depressed person, and then the same as another depressed person. There is this variation in the way that all people kind of come into this, and how do you sit with them and think about that? Yeah, I appreciate that. I was thinking about that too, is how you manage yourself in the context of a community that would have a really clear way of thinking about how we should do this.
Yeah. I think there's another piece of this that I think is important, and this is just something I've learned from experience. But what I've found is that most of the perpetrators that I've either met or interacted with or have heard of from my clients, I've found out that they were once victims themselves. And I think that's useful information. And when I was living in South Africa, part of the work I was doing was I was working for a nonprofit, and I would get to play soccer with traffickers from Nigeria. That was part of the thing that I got to do as a ministry project and as a part of this nonprofit. And they were all Nigerian men who had come from Nigeria to South Africa, and they got involved in the trafficking industry and ended up becoming pimps and traffickers. But what was fascinating is as I got to know these men, they would share their stories with me, and every single one of them was trafficked into South Africa on this promise to play professional soccer and to make a lot of money. And so they were victims just as much as the girls under them were victims. And that kind of prompted this, again, the idea of like that multi-generational process of, wait a minute, like it didn't start here and this goes back. And in the example I gave earlier with the client who was abused by her grandfather, when I was able to get a little bit more clear-headed on looking at the system, we were able to uncover a multi-generational pattern of abuse on both the mother and father side of the family. So the mom had also been abused. The father, also there was abuse in his family going back several generations. But I wouldn't have been able to see that if I was still so focused on just victim perpetrator and that's it. So I think, again, Bowen theory there's so much value in being able to view the system as a system and to zoom out and to consider other factors that might be playing a role in something that's happening, right in front of us.
Yeah. And I was thinking about, and your ability to stay objective about that, right? To really think with them multi-generationally and stay objective. We were having a conversation earlier today in another meeting I was in about sexual abuse and how, you can't, I think personally, it's really challenging to stay neutral. We talk about this idea of neutrality and, I think it's different, like my own personal feelings of how I manage that. But the gift I think that Bowen theory can give me is the ability to get really objective in how I might get reactive in talking about this, but also like objective, like you just described. And, how does this client think about this multi-generational process of, multiple people being abused in the system and what she's up against, he or she is up against. I mean, just having that knowledge, I think, is useful to people. Yeah. I had another question, I think, for you, Sam, is I was thinking about one of the goals of this podcast is to really talk about theory in a more, what is our thing? Brief and understandable ways. I was wondering how much of theory you bring into your work when you're talking with clients or talking with these communities. I mean, I understand you do a lot of, public talking about this topic. So I was just curious how you bring theory into that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do have a tendency to get caught up in the jargon of things. So that's something that I'm working on is how do I explain this in like a very real, like a real life kind of easy to understand way. And I think that's something Dr. Kathleen Smith does brilliantly. So I've learned from her a lot on that and in her writing. But one thing I love to do that I find is usually very helpful is I have this giant whiteboard in my office. It's like massive right over here. And I use it a lot. So if I'm talking with a client and they start describing a relationship process or a conflict they're having or something, whether it's with the perpetrator or a family member or friends, whatever it is, I will start drawing diagrams on the board. And just having a visual, I think, can be very helpful. It's helpful for me to stay zoomed out and focused, but I think it's also helpful for them to start to kind of see the patterns and to think systems. And so the diagrams is something I love to do. I had the privilege last year of doing a workshop at a safe house up in Houston, and we worked with the staff there, and I was able to do kind of like an overview of Bowen theory for them because they were having a lot of issues with staff and resident relationships. So there's a lot of conflict, a lot of turnover, a lot of just like messy things happening at the safe home. And so being able to kind of do like an introduction to Bowen theory of, hey, let's think about, these concepts and how do you see this show up in your own family? And what about sibling position? And just kind of introducing these ideas and letting them sort of like share what they notice and what they think, and use examples from, the safe home itself and conflicts that have happened that day. That's always very helpful. So it hasn't been too hard kind of integrating those things together.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, just that idea of emotional process, and there are sort of these predictable ways people respond. And I think people can hold on to that, right? Like you guys are getting in conflicts. This is a natural response to, tension in the system. This is a pretty tense system. So to think about that, what are the other options that they could kind of employ to respond? Yeah. Thank you. I think that's, I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah. It fit. My takeaway was look around you. Can you see the bigger picture? And part of it was, can you see what in the system contributes to improvement as much as you can see what contributes to struggle? And I was just in the Bowen Center Faith Leadership conference today until 15 minutes before this. And Jenny Brown was speaking, and I'll try to find a link, but her worry cycle, I think, is so helpful to think about how we worry about whether it's a client or whether it's someone in our family, and observing that and kind of working around that, stepping out of that a little bit. Yeah. What about takeaways for you guys?
I think for me, I wrote this down. I was thinking about this earlier. When people think about survivors of trafficking, I've noticed how quickly the question becomes, how do we help them? Or how do I help them? And I think that Bowen theory invites a different set of questions. And I think some of these could be, how does my desire to help potentially reinforce a pattern of helplessness in another? I think that's good to think about.
Great
And then
question.
is my desire to help, this is a big one I'm still learning, is my desire to help based on a realistic need that this person has, or is it coming from a more anxious place inside me? And I think this shows up a lot in the work that I do, where there's this urgency. Y'all described like the intensity, and it is very intense, but I think that it can be easy to get caught up in that intensity where it might not actually be as urgent, or there might not be as much danger as we think there is. And yet I'm acting as if it's a level 10 when really it might be a level 3. So being able to, I've said it before, is not colluding with the family's urgency. This idea of like, how do I stay separate enough from that family's emotional processes and that emotional system to think clearly and factually about what this client needs? Because they realistically might need support with filing a report or, going to court or something like that. But they may not need to be thrusted into a safe house, within 24 hours. And so being able to kind of gauge how at risk is this person, what are the realistic needs and the actual threats versus the perceived threats that I'm feeling because I'm scared, being able to think clearly about that, I think can be incredibly helpful. So that's something I'm still working on and learning how to do.
I appreciate that. I think that's so useful in Stephanie Ferrera, I think, I'll correct myself. I'll have Dixie wrote an article on the role of the helper in a family systems journal that's probably quite a few years old that I found useful. But I always joke that as an older sister, I come from a long line of helpers, that I sometimes need to literally sit on my hands, like put a visual in my head to stop myself from jumping to the helper role, which is another way where my takeaway is going to come from. I have a quote that I wanted to put in. I'm appreciative when other people say it better than I would be able to. So this is Amy Post saying, differentiation of self all the way really does begin and end with me in the coaching role. So defining my role, what am I responsible to, and how will I be responsible for myself in relating to the other? I think it's important to be clear that what you're aiming at in Bowen theory is differentiation of self within yourself, but that you are also inviting the folks you are working with to aim at that. So I think that's summarizes a lot of the thinking we've had here today, is that the difference that I think that Bowen theory brings is simultaneously thinking about the work of differentiation for the clinician, both in balancing their thinking and feeling and relating to this client and system that they're in front of, and getting interested and curious about how that person wants to take that on. So that's my takeaway is how do people think about that beautiful question? What am I responsible to, and how will I be responsible for myself in relating to the other?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot these past few months about, I had a supervisor right out of my master's who appreciated Bowen theory, but wasn't like a Bowen supervisor. And I would come in as a weepy mess. Like, I think I just cried through our hour supervision every week. And at the end of the hour, she would say, now go be Dixie. And I'm like, well, I don't think Dixie knows anything. And there was something like she could stay a little bit separate, a little bit more clear-headed about me, and then invited me to be a little bit more solid in my, So it was helpful for me.
I appreciate that word invitation. I think I've heard in different ways today. So maybe that's, a good takeaway for people too, to think about what they're inviting themselves to take on in this work.
Yeah. Did anything else that anyone wanted to say, or did we get through it all?
This is a little bit random, but I have a quote here that I wrote down. I'm a big fan of like the hero's journey. I love like movies and books with the hero's journey. So I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings. I'm a super nerd when it comes to that, and like Star Wars and all that stuff. And there's this quote that I was thinking about, and it's between Frodo and Gandalf, and Frodo was the one who had to carry and bear the burden of the ring, and Gandalf was his wise wizard mentor who was helping to lead him on this horrible, crazy, stressful journey. And Frodo says to him, he says, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And I love that quote. And it makes me think of, the families and the survivors I work with, because we can't undo what happened. And there's no going backwards. There's really only going forward. And so it's like, I think part of differentiation is deciding what I want to do with what has been given to me. And I think Bowen echoes that in his quote about you've inherited a lifetime of tribulation. Once you think you know the right way, do the best you can with it. I feel like, it's kind of very Gandalf centered. And so I think that really rings true here of, it's like, all right, here's what you got. Give it your best shot. Go all in.
And now I'm just going to think of Bowen and Gandalf. So thank you for that.
Have to put a staff in his hand or something in one of those classic pictures. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's good. Good. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Sam.
Yeah, thank you both so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So I'm going to end the podcast before we end today. We, as you have heard, we're trying something different this season, where if you would like to support the efforts of this podcast, to make it available, please support us by donating to the coffee link below. We appreciate your support. And it goes we're not paid to be on the podcast, but there are a lot of back of the scenes kind of efforts that it takes to make this go together. So if you could support that, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Super. So many things to think about today, and hopefully some new ideas for our listeners to consider as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.